$100,000 house, you're not just paying for the plumbers and the carpenters. You're also paying for the agents, the real estate agents. And the bank is financing that. So if you're going to buy a $500,000 home, you need $50,000 of a down payment, a 10% down payment. Under the new system, the buyer is supposed to pay their own agent or advisor. That would mean that they would have to come out of pocket, not just that $50,000 down payment, but another $15,000 for their agent. That we should pass a law that makes it plain that when you finance a home, the loan should include, as it does now, the amount being charged by the agents. So that same $500,000 home would get a $450,000 mortgage. If we don't do that, then a couple trying to build up their down payment, instead of having to do that for 10 years, will end up spending 13 years before they can afford to buy a home. As to the matter before us, the rule in Washington is clear. When the facts are with you, argue the facts. When the public policy is with you, argue the public policy. And when you've got bad facts and you're wrong on the public policy, scream about the procedure. And that is what the detractors of the SEC are doing. The fact is that we do need guidance to be published from the SEC. When the SEC provides that guidance in the crypto accounting area, then we're told, oh my God, we don't need guidance. We just need a patina of regulation, but not any real regulation for the crypto industry, so they can give the illusion that they are regulated. I should point out that the SEC is finally doing what we told them to do by law in Dodd-Frank in 2010. We are not watching a NASCAR race. We are watching a turtle race in which now, in 2024, the SEC is doing what we told them to do back when I had hair. No, okay, I still didn't have hair then. I want to point out that this recent near government shutdown has delayed IPOs because anybody trying to raise money in the Capitol knew the SEC would have to shut its doors, or might not shut its doors, or might shut its doors, and has made it more difficult for the United States to compete for capital worldwide by showing that we had a workable government and financial system. As to the length of time for commenting, the average that the SEC is giving is 67 days, and the way to calculate that is from the day the SEC publishes the proposed rule on their website, not waiting many days later till it finally gets in the Federal Register. Why is that more relevant? Because you talk to investors, you talk to broker-dealers, they've all heard of the SEC, and if they want to know what the SEC is doing, they're going to go sec.gov. None of them have thought of the Federal Register. I was just at the New York Stock Exchange. A dozen people mentioned the SEC. Not a single one of them mentioned the Federal Register. We need climate disclosures because they are material to a material percentage of the investors investing in American markets. And this idea that we're going to deprive investors of the information they want because we don't want them to have it is a bad approach, and thank God the SEC's gone the other direction. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Waters, who's also the ranking member of the full Committee of Financial Services, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. The SEC has played a critical role over the past 90 years in protecting investors from fraud and abuse and ensuring U.S. corporations provide adequate information about themselves so working families can make sound decisions with their money. While the agency has done a solid job under the Biden administration, I believe there's still much more work to be done. For example, we need transparency in the unregulated private securities markets, and we need rules to stop corporate executives from engaging in any stock buybacks. And we need more comprehensive climate risk disclosures that apply to all issuers. The SEC also needs to be fully funded so that it remains an effective and relevant regulator for the next 90 years. So I look forward to this discussion today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Today, we welcome the testimony of David Burton. Mr. Burton is the Senior Fellow in Economic Policy at the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. John Gulliver. Mr. Gulliver is the Executive Director of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. Ms. Jennifer Schulp. Ms. Schulp is the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. And Ms. Alexandra Thornton. Ms. Thornton is the Senior Director of Financial Regulation for Inclusive Economy at the Center for American Progress. We thank each of you for taking the time to be here. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation of your testimony. And without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Burton, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is David Burton. I'm Senior Fellow in Economic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to express my thanks to Chairman Wagner and Ranking Member Sherman and members of the committee for the opportunity to be here this morning. As the most important regulator of U.S. capital markets, the Securities and Exchange Commission has a vital mission. We need an effective cop on the beat to prevent fraud, to ensure adequate disclosure, and promote efficient markets if we're to have a strong capital markets, a vibrant economy, and to protect and secure the savings of the American people. Unfortunately, despite its glowing self-image, the Commission does an increasingly bad job of discharging its core functions. There are at least 5 reasons for this. First, Commission resources have flowed into unnecessary management, support, and ancillary functions, while core functions have been neglected. The SEC is managed exceedingly poorly and has been for quite some time. Its organizational structure is unwieldy and inconsistent with sound management practices. It's among the most management-heavy and bureaucratic agencies in government. Its information technology function is among the most expensive and least effective in government. Oversight of its contracting process is poor. Second, it provides inadequate oversight of so-called self-regulatory organizations. And in the aggregate, these non-governmental organizations to whom regulatory authority has been delegated have personnel levels and budgets that are comparable to the SEC itself. Third, the Commission does an inadequate job of providing the information necessary for policymakers, whether commissioners or members of Congress, to make informed judgments about the policy choices that they face. Fourth, the Commission has failed to address current regulatory issues, opting instead to pursue regulation by enforcement or to largely ignore serious problems. Fifth and last, the Commission is now pursuing political and ideological objectives that are unrelated to its core mission. In my written statement, I address all of these issues in detail. Under Chairman Gensler, massive amounts of Commission and Commission staff time and resources have been diverted to ideological projects that are unrelated to the Commission's statutory charge. Entirely independent of the merits of his ideological objectives, this pursuit is doing real damage because the Commission is increasingly ignoring its real job. Instead, it's focusing on climate regulation, diversity, equity, inclusion, board diversity, and various social justice objectives under the rubric of human capital management. The Commission is a securities regulator. Its mission is to protect investors and promote efficiency, competition, and capital formation. It is not meant to right every conceivable social wrong, nor can it do so. It's not an environmental regulator. It's not the EEOC or the Civil Rights Commission. It's not the Department of Labor or the NLRB. It should discharge the mission that Congress has given it. I'd like to briefly run through a number of the pieces of legislation that the committee is considering. And I'll have to do this quickly, but the legislation that would roll the PCAOB back into the SEC is welcome. The PCAOB, creating the PCAOB was a mistake, and putting it back in the government will restore due process, transparency, and rulemaking protections normally associated with government. The streamlining, The SEC Regulatory Accountability Act is a very well-drafted piece of legislation. It would codify in the Securities Exchange Act the requirement to conduct rigorous cost-benefit analysis in the rulemaking process and provide for a robust and detailed retrospective review process. It would also apply these requirements for the first time to FINRA and MSRB by making the SEC determine that they complied with these requirements before the SEC approves those rulemakings. The legislation that would require a GAO study of the information technology programs at the SEC are welcome. As I go into in significant detail in my written statement, the SEC's IT department is among the most expensive in government and among the least effective. I'm very sympathetic to the goals and objectives of the legislation that would require a GAO review of the SEC cost-benefit analysis in up to 10 rulemakings, and go into some more detail about that in my written statement. I think the legislation requiring at least 60 days, 60-day comment period for rulemakings is entirely warranted, particularly given the size, scope, and complexity of the rules that the SEC is putting out these days. With that, my time has expired, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gulliver. I'm sorry, not Mr. Gulliver. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Burton. Mr. Gulliver, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation.
Thank you, Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify before you today on the topic of SEC overreach, examining the need for reform. My testimony today is my own and does not necessarily reflect the views of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation or its members. The United States benefits from the world's most efficient capital markets. This means that companies can raise the funding needed to grow and investors can earn a return on their savings at a low cost. The U.S. capital markets are therefore critical for economic growth and prosperity. The SEC is tasked with the vital role of regulating approximately 3,600 public companies, as well as the broker-dealers, investment advisors, and other market participants that presently provide 76 million U.S. households with the opportunity to invest in our markets. Over the past 3 years, under Chair Gensler's leadership, the SEC has embarked on an unprecedented rulemaking agenda that will have a major impact on the cost of being a public company and investing in our markets. The SEC has done so without a new statutory mandate or a market crisis presenting the need for holistic reform. The SEC has also not conducted a comprehensive analysis of how its rulemakings will collectively impact public companies and investors. Now is therefore precisely the time to consider whether reforms to the SEC's regulatory process are needed. As with all federal agencies, the SEC is required to provide the public with an opportunity to comment on its proposed rules. The SEC is also required to conduct an economic analysis as part of each rulemaking, and SEC rules are subject to review and reversal by the courts if they fail to comply with these requirements. Over the past 3 years, there have been significant deficiencies with the SEC's regulatory process. Short public comment periods for SEC rulemakings have failed to reflect the proposal's significance and complexity. According to an estimate by SIFMA, the average period of time for comment for recent SEC proposals has been just 47 days. This has made it difficult, if not impossible, for the public to fully analyze and respond to the SEC's proposals. The SEC has also on several recent occasions issued rules on overlapping issues, such as the securities lending and short selling disclosure rules, but failed to consider their aggregate impact or interaction between those rules. This has resulted in conflicting regulations, and the SEC's securities lending and short selling rules are now being challenged in the Fifth Circuit on this basis. Economic analyses by the SEC have also had major shortcomings. The SEC's share buyback rule was recently overturned by the Fifth Circuit due to flaws with its economic analysis. And the SEC's private funds rule, which is also being challenged in court, also has fundamental issues with its economic analysis. For example, the SEC asserted that there is a lack of competition in the market for private equity fund, venture capital fund, and hedge fund advisors. However, the SEC ignored the fundamental metrics that both government authorities and academic experts use to measure whether a market is competitive. And the evidence on private fund fees, performance, and industry concentration demonstrates that the private funds market is highly competitive, thus undercutting the SEC's economic analysis and Chair Gensler's basis for the rulemaking. Due to these various shortcomings, I support legislative reforms to clarify and enhance the SEC's regulatory process. As part of its economic analyses, the SEC should be required to, 1, clearly identify and substantiate that a market failure exists and that a rule will address that failure. 2, make a reasonable determination that the benefits of a rule would outweigh its costs. And 3, consider the effects of other related rules, including proposals. These recommendations are consistent with the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act. The SEC should also be required to periodically review its past rulemakings to identify rules that have become obsolete or ineffective, as is required now in the European Union. Congress should also establish a minimum comment period of 60 days for SEC rulemakings and 180 days for complex rules. This would be consistent with existing federal agency guidelines. Thank you for the invitation to testify before the subcommittee today.
Thank you, Mr. Gulliver. Next, Ms. Schulp, you are recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets. My name is Jennifer Schulp, and I am the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Thank you for the opportunity to take part in today's hearing. Regulatory decision-making by the Securities and Exchange Commission directly impacts our securities markets. While the stock market and the economy are not one and the same, the ability of individuals and entities to raise capital to grow their businesses and the ability to invest in businesses is the backbone of American economic growth. The SEC's mission cannot be, and is not intended to be, carried out without accountability to elected officials and input by the public. The SEC, however, falls short of this ideal. The Commission would benefit from reforms aimed at increasing the agency's accountability and transparency, ensuring adequate input and analysis for rulemaking, and holding the agency to high standards in the exercise of its functions. First, congressional oversight is critical to ensuring the proper functioning of the federal government. Regular testimony by the SEC chairman and commissioners can increase the agency's accountability and transparency and depoliticize the fact of congressional oversight. Other reforms to the SEC's enforcement authority can increase accountability. The Commission's gag rule on settling defendants silences critics who can help Congress and the public hold the agency accountable. And the SEC's use of administrative law judges similarly denies defendants and the public of the accountability provided by independent judicial courts. Second, the Commission has a mixed record at best complying with the Administrative Procedure Act, which provides for public participation in the rulemaking process and sets forth the basic standards for rulemaking. The Commission has often inappropriately relied on agency guidance and enforcement actions to create new regulation. These tools produce less certain and less clear rules and can result in unfair treatment of market participants, undermining public trust in the agency. Moreover, pursuing these pathways decreases regulation quality by preventing public input, which is at the heart of the APA's design for rulemaking. Under the APA, an agency must provide meaningful opportunity to comment on proposed rules. The current SEC has advanced an aggressive rulemaking agenda and has provided less opportunity for public comment. These rule proposals have been complex and interconnected, increasing the burdens to analyze and meaningfully respond. Congress should consider setting a baseline for SEC comment periods, ensuring appropriate time for public input. The Commission should also repropose rules for public comment where the rule is substantially revised from the proposal. The SEC is also required by the APA to weigh and, where possible, quantify the costs and benefits of a proposed regulation. But the SEC's economic analyses often fail to account for costs and rely on speculative benefits. This is particularly apparent where the SEC's interconnected rule proposals do not analyze the impact of each proposal on the other. A clear legislative cost-benefit analysis requirement may assist in shoring up existing obligations. Third, the Commission continues to suffer from embarrassing cybersecurity and information technology incidents. The information that the Commission collects should be right-sized by, for example, prohibiting investor personally identifiable information in the consolidated audit trail. This not only avoids the question of whether the SEC can safeguard the data, but also avoids serious constitutional concerns with such surveillance. The agency must also identify and promptly remedy cybersecurity and information technology weaknesses. The SEC recognizes for its regulated entities that managing cyber and information risks is critical to the operation of the financial markets. Yet, within the past 2 years, the SEC has been hacked on X, not received public comments due to a glitch with an internet comment form, and allowed enforcement staff to access administrative law judge documents. Such issues have market impacts and erode confidence in the agency. To sum up, the Commission would benefit from reforms to improve its accountability, responsiveness, and competence, regardless of the Commission's policy agenda. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
We thank you, Ms. Schultz. Next, Ms. Thornton. You're recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and esteemed members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. In the interest of time, I'll focus my oral remarks on the Commission's rulemaking process and the Private Fund Advisors Rule. The Administrative Procedure Act does not require an agency to make changes in response to every comment. Court decisions are clear that the point of the APA process is for the agency to make a reasonable effort to solicit relevant information so that it can examine the relevant data and articulate a satisfactory explanation for its action, including a rational connection between the facts found and the choice made. This is not what is happening now. Instead, opponents of SEC rulemakings are misusing reasonable administrative process protections and turning them into years-long gauntlets for agency actions. And a handful of relatively recent court decisions have made this process even more burdensome on the agency and thrust important rules into jeopardy. These outside pressures have added unreasonable expectations for the administrative process, impeding the SEC's ability to do its job of protecting investors and promoting more fair, orderly, and efficient markets. In response to attacks, the Commission appears to be bending over backward to allow for lengthy periods of comment, routinely consider comments received outside the comment window, even though that is not legally required, and reopen formal comment periods. And it now appears to seek to address nearly every point raised by commenters, regardless of the relevance or when received. Meanwhile, the Commission's economic analyses are longer and much more complex. The result of all of this analysis is a paralysis. As the agency's agenda shows, many rules sought by business and investors, respectively, have yet to be proposed, much less finalized. Larger companies, financial firms, and other market participants often overwhelm the agency with letters, which far outstrips the agency's ability to sift through the morass. The agency simply does not have enough staff to engage in this strained analysis for thousands of comments on every single rulemaking. One legislative proposal being considered today calls for congressional disapproval of the Private Fund Advisors Rule finalized last September.
I'd ask the witness to suspend for just a moment. There seems to be a ruckus here in our... If you'd like to join us, we'd welcome if you could just sit quickly and quietly. You're most welcome. My apologies, Ms. Thornton. Please do continue.
Certainly. Now?
Please do continue, ma'am.
All right. Private funds have grown in size, complexity, and number in the past decade since the Dodd-Frank Act required private fund advisors to begin registering with the SEC. More than 5,000 SEC-registered investment advisors, roughly 35% of all SEC-registered advisors, manage about $18 trillion in private fund assets. The SEC's Division of Examinations has found substantial concerns with deficiencies of private fund advisors. In response, the Private Fund Advisors Rule addresses common risks and harms in an advisor's relationship with private funds and their investors: lack of transparency, conflicts of interest, and lack of effective governance mechanisms for client disclosure, consent, and oversight. The disclosures to address these are all squarely within the SEC's authority to require from private fund advisors. This essential rule takes on heightened importance given the rapid growth of private markets generally. Today, teachers, firefighters, and millions of other workers with public and private retirement plans are materially exposed to the private markets, and private fund advisors have significant control over these investments. Over the past few decades, Congress and the SEC have dramatically expanded exemptions from application of the federal securities laws, including ongoing public reporting requirements. This has led to the explosive growth of private markets, where now more capital is raised annually than in the public markets. And while companies with a large number of holders of record have long been required to begin public disclosures, a loophole has allowed companies to effectively avoid the law's application, even if they have tens of thousands of beneficial owners or shareholders. Allowing extremely large companies that have thousands of employees and sell to millions of Americans to avoid basic disclosure rules invites waste, fraud, and abuses, not unlike those that predated the adoption of the federal securities laws. Exemptions are dismantling the securities laws that have served the U.S. capital markets for so long and made them the most liquid and trusted in the world. During debate over securities legislation in the 1930s, Congress considered making the SEC a merit regulator with authority to prevent securities offerings that did not meet standards of quality. It rejected that idea with the understanding that companies seeking capital from the public would be required to make any disclosures that the SEC found to be, quote, in the public interest and for the protection of investors, close quote. This language is repeatedly mentioned in the statutes and legislative history of the securities laws. But the wholesale exemption of securities offerings from the public disclosure framework has undermined Congress's intent. The solution is either to give the SEC a stronger hand in making regulations aimed at protecting all investors from investments they cannot possibly understand well enough to make a sound investment decision, no matter how sophisticated they are, or alternatively, to shrink the exemptions, close the loopholes so that larger companies comply with the public disclosure framework and prevent the remaining private companies from raising capital from retail investors directly or indirectly without providing the same rules, types of disclosures that public companies make. Thank you again for inviting me to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
We thank you, Ms. Thornton. Now, we will turn to member questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gulliver, I am deeply concerned with the quality of analysis that SEC staff includes with many of its proposed and final rules. In the equity market structure proposals, for example, SEC staff apparently cut and paste the same economic analysis and applied it to every rule. My bill, the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act, requires the SEC to consider specified factors before issuing regulations. Could you explain how my bill would improve the quality of the SEC's analysis, sir?
I think the most significant improvement is it would require the SEC to identify an actual problem. There is no problem in the U.S. equity market structure. The SEC's economic analysis ignored the fact that the U.S. equity market structure provides the lowest cost in the world. So the cost to trade in the U.S. is lower than it is in Europe, the U.K., Japan, Hong Kong, any other developed market. So I think that would be a major improvement.
And could you explain how higher quality analyses would promote better policymaking outcomes and prevent overreach?
I think most importantly, it's a fundamental point of policy that the benefits of a rule should exceed its costs. So requiring that explicitly through legislation would serve an important policy purpose.
And certainly need more specific economic analysis than just literally cutting and pasting the same analysis over and over again. It was stunning. Mr. Gulliver, what would you say to Democrats who believe there is nothing wrong with the quality of SEC's economic analysis?
I would say that issues with the SEC's economic analysis have been raised by former SEC chief economists from Democratic and Republican presidents.
Yes. Ms. Schulp, as chairman of the subcommittee, I am committed to making sure unelected officials like SEC Chair Gensler remain accountable to the American people. And as part of those efforts throughout this Congress, I've brought each of the SEC division directors in to testify before this subcommittee. The full committee has also brought Chair Gensler in to testify on several occasions. Ms. Schulp, can you explain why it is important that regulators testify before Congress on a regular and more frequent basis?
First, this type of exchange of information between members of Congress and regulators is an important one, and it supplements letters that go back and forth that might not be answered or may not be answered in an appropriate manner. But it's also important to have a live back and forth between a member of Congress and the entity that it's regulating in the public sphere. It's very important to make sure that this is standardized as well and happens regularly so that it's not simply that oversight happens when there's divided government.
I wonder what impact might it have if the full commission, not just the chair, were to regularly testify before Congress? Would it remind the commission of its accountability to Congress and the American public?
It should remind the commission of such, and it's also important because the commission is a 5-member body. It is not simply the chair, and that body was designed to be bipartisan. Hearing from minority viewpoints as well as viewpoints other than the commissioner is important for members of Congress as well as the public.
Mr. Burton, last year the SEC adopted an onerous cybersecurity risk management rule, which, as Commissioner Peirce explained, quote, ignores both the limits to the SEC disclosure authority and the best interests of investors. Just a few months later, the SEC official X, formerly known as Twitter, account was hacked. Mr. Burton, can you elaborate on the quality of information technology management at the SEC?
Yes, I think you've identified a very important problem with the SEC, and it falls into a couple categories. One is data security. The SEC documents, if they're hacked, can move markets, and people can trade on information that's not yet public and make a great deal of money. But there are other problems. For example, the public disclosure system under EDGAR sort of involves time travel. You feel like you're going back to the 1990s because it's so bad. And most people don't use EDGAR to get the information. They use private systems that rely on
And
data.
Mr. Burton, because my time's about to expire, but, what signal does it send when the SEC's own social media account is hacked just a few months after it imposes onerous cybersecurity requirements on the company it regulates?
It shows that the SEC is not doing its job, and the SEC's IT department is 5 times more expensive than the average, yet they have worse results.
I thank you, and my time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, the ranking member, for 5 minutes for questioning.
I would say, what signal does it send when Congress comes within days of defunding the SEC or suspending its funding again and again? Perhaps the worst slogan I've heard in politics is defund the police. The SEC is the police of our $100 trillion capital markets, and several different times we've come within days of not having the cops on the beat. I join with the chair in saying that we should have the entire commission here, and I look forward to those hearings. I think the ratings on C-SPAN 3 will go through the roof, to the moon. There's this argument that we're moving too fast. I think we're just catching up with mandates that we imposed in 2010. And with climate disclosure, we've been wanting that since Al Gore was living in the Naval Observatory. Finally, we've got it, and I think the SEC did a good job at a very difficult job. This does not mean that the SEC is perfect. First, we haven't forced disclosures from giant non-public companies that play such a critical role in our country. Looking at what the SEC has jurisdiction of, the definition of accredited investor relates to whether you have a $200,000 income, when it should relate to the knowledge of your truly independent investors, and the percentage of your net worth that you're investing in the company. The SEC's proposals on swing pricing and the related liquidity proposals, I think will do more harm than good, but particularly the swing pricing proposals. We do need regulations. The crypto industry has come to us many times saying, please tell us what the rules are. Of course, whenever rules are meaningful, they then rebel against them. And it's said that our capital markets are great, and they are the envy of the world, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking more to cut costs. One of the bills that witness pointed out too, it deals with the PCAOB. We need a PCAOB. We were here when we had WorldCom and Enron. But and I don't think the PCAOB is broken, but I'd be supportive of that bill, bringing that inside the SEC, if we did it also with the FASB, which is broken in one critical respect, and that is that flying in the face of any reasonable accounting theory. They have mandated writing off R&D expenses when they should be capitalized. And if they were, our companies, particularly the non-tech companies, would be doing far more R&D. So if the PCAOB structure is bad, it's also the same structure basically as the FASB. And if we want to bring them in-house, let's bring in-house the one that's broken, or is broken as to one major aspect. As to insufficient comment periods, I'd support legislation saying 60 days for any complex rule, but the 60 days have got to be measured from when the SEC puts it on their webpage. Ms. Thornton, there are those who say that if you want to make an investment based on something other than earnings per share, say on the basis of whether the company is doing a good job in reducing its climate footprint, that you should be deprived of the right to manage your own money, not by appointing a conservator, which we do for those who are criminally insane, but rather just deprive you of the information that would allow you to make a decision. Does it make sense in a capitalist society to tell people with capital that they can't make a decision based on climate?
Not at all. In fact, capitalism is about information. Information is what makes capitalism work. And there are many kinds of information that have an impact on the value of a company and would impact an investor's decision about whether to invest. Things like climate risk, because that can actually determine whether a company is resilient in the long run, whether it's prepared for changes in the law around emissions, for example, but also in the near term, whether it's ready for disasters that are obviously coming. We have more and more billion-dollar climate
If I can
disasters.
interrupt, I think investors are interested in how the company affects the environment, but also how the environment is going to affect the profitability of the company. That information needs to be disclosed, and we also need more information about workforce, particularly training and turnover, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much and for holding this hearing. Mr. Gulliver, thank you for being here. I'm going to aim my few minutes with you. Delighted to see that you are here today. You have written rather extensively about what happened in 2022 when the S&P companies spent over $900 billion to buy back their own stock. Followed up in May of 23 by the Securities and Exchange Commission adopting the rule that would have required public companies to disclose information about stock repurchases, including certain repurchase data within 1 business day and the rationale for doing that. In other words, the federal government would require you to tell us why you did what you did, a private business. This was vacated by the Fifth Circuit then later on December the 19th, 2023. The essence of the argument was that the SEC did not even follow their own rules, did not include a proper cost-benefit analysis of what this regulatory overview would mean to the industry. But what bothers me is it's based upon a philosophy. In my opinion, it's a parasite designed to kill the host by the SEC. It is actually the SEC trying to work against that which they're expected to nurture and grow as part of not just American exceptionalism, but perhaps more important, capitalism. Can you lend some ideas about this action by the SEC to the entire marketplace?
I think that was an example, the SEC repurchase disclosure rule is an example of a particularly flawed cost-benefit analysis and the importance of doing a high-quality analysis. So the SEC asserted that there was a problem where executives were, buying back shares on a particularly advantageous basis for themselves, but in fact, they didn't provide any evidence to support that claim. and the court found that the SEC is obligated to do so in all their economic analyses. So one positive take from this is that future economic analyses, if the SEC claims there's a market failure, they have to substantiate it. The second issue was the SEC said there was no data to really do an in-depth analysis of whether or not this is a problem, but commenters provided the SEC with that data. And the court said, we're invalidating the rule for that.
So you've come to this committee and we hear about the cops on the beat, how important they are for the SEC to do this. Yet they're the party that wants to defund the police. They're the ones that don't want police who follow the law and rules. A police officer on the beat just can't go make up his own reason for doing something, can they? No, they cannot. But the SEC believes they can. Time after time, we've seen this, or 1071, any of a number of examples where the SEC does what they want to do. I believe, and I think what's been proven by this committee, is that they are attempting to put into place and to harm economic growth of the United States of America, the marketplace, and the things that would build value not only for all Americans, but the stock market in America specifically. What other examples do you have of this overreach and overregulation?
I think one of the most concerning examples is the SEC reaching into private markets. Our private markets have been successful for a number of reasons, but what we've been seeing in those markets is a reduction in the fees that the large private funds charge, increasing performance, very strong performance, and small companies getting a lot of funding in these private markets. So the SEC is shifting in a direction of bringing more public regulations into these private markets, and I think that would be a big problem because a big reason that companies are staying private longer is to avoid the burdens of being a public company.
And that harms new entrants, doesn't it? Who many times who would be minority or women-owned and trying to gain entrance into the marketplace, they're making it far more difficult for them not only to enter the marketplace, but to be successful. Would you call them activists?
I think it's been a very aggressive SEC, unprecedented.
Well, it's against the free enterprise system. That's what this hearing's about today, and I want to thank each of you for taking time to be here today. Madam Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Waters, who is the ranking member of the full Committee on Financial Services, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to direct this question to Ms. Thornton. When most Americans think about our capital markets, they think of the New York Stock Exchange and stocks sold by large companies like Apple, Ford, or GE. These are the public markets where new companies get to ring the bell when they go public and where U.S. capitalism flourished. However, many would be surprised to learn that the private markets now dwarf the public markets for where securities like these are normally offered and sold. Today, companies that have billions in revenue, tens of thousands of employees, thousands of shareholders, and engage in practices that impact the communities they operate in are under no obligations to share information that their investors, consumers, or stakeholders may find important. Could you discuss what gets lost when large companies that access our capital markets stay opaque and unaccountable? Does Congress need to set new rules for these types of large companies that have significant impact on our society? Or do you think the SEC has sufficient authority to promulgate rules in this space?
Thank you, Congresswoman Waters. I think that there is a lot that the SEC can do here. There may be some things that Congress might need to do, but I think there's a lot that the SEC can do because it created many of the exemptions that are allowing so many in the private markets to access capital, to grow in the private markets without limit, and not having to go to the public markets. So there's a lot they can do also with respect to holder of record. I'm not 100% sure that they can do that on their own. There's some debate about it, but holder of record does need to be defined as beneficial owners, and that is shareholders, not as holders of record, so that institutional investors who actually hold shares for thousands of clients are counted as one holder of record. If you could change that rule, then you would have a lot of these large companies automatically having to register, become public companies, and do the public reporting that is so necessary for huge companies that employ so many people and that sell products and services to millions and millions of Americans.
Well, thank you. As I'm listening to some of our witnesses here today, they oppose regulation, too much regulation. Do you think that they would oppose knowing and having information that you just described about beneficial ownership? What do you think?
I think all shareholders want information, and even the most sophisticated, intelligent investor cannot make good decisions without information. And the power dynamic in the private markets is unfair, unequal. Information that is given to one investor or group of investors does not have to be given to other investors because there's no cop on the beat, as you say. And so to address that, I think, is one of the most important things and a critical thing that the SEC needs to do immediately today with the growth of the private markets to protect investors.
For the record, the SEC is our cop on the block, protecting investors. This criticism that you've heard here today about them impeding economic growth, don't you think that perhaps that's a little misstatement about the SEC, for the record?
Yeah, I think that without information, you can have inefficiencies, you can have fraud. That's a huge waste of resources and capital. Capital can't flow to the highest and best use if there isn't information for investors. So, yeah.
Do you believe that our investors today need to rely and depend on SEC? And rather than stripping SEC of its ability to regulate, they want to make sure that they're doing a job to protect their investments. What do you think?
I think that without rules, it's possible for people who would do that to take advantage of others not having the information. And that's what the SEC is there to prevent, is to ensure that everybody has access to information and that companies disclose important information, basic information, financials, basic information about operations, and so forth. This is basic information that all investors need. And without the SEC, you wouldn't have disclosure of that.
Thank you. I'm so pleased you're here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I don't know about the rest of my colleagues. I'm opposed to regulation, too much regulation, only when it defies common sense. And that, frankly, is what we are seeing here today in some of the defense of the indefensible. Materiality is the watchword. And the most recent disclosure rule that the SEC has issued is not material. Public companies, let's be clear, public companies must report any issue or circumstance that currently or in the future will materially affect their business operation and therefore affect investors. And what the courts are saying is the Securities and Exchange Commission is outside not only its traditional, but its legal bounds when it comes to that materiality question with this most recent disclosure requirement. So I should say, Ms. Schulp, good to see you again. Mr. Gulliver, I think you have are now my new favorite Harvard professor after reading your testimony. Mr. Burton, I want to focus in a little bit, though, on an issue that I've been working on, the PCAOB. The PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, was founded in 2002 as an independent expert regulatory agency to oversee audits of public companies. In fact, the word independent appears in statute 10 times. So it's safe to say that when Congress created the board, they intended it to operate independently and without regard to political considerations. Notwithstanding the SEC's oversight authorities, including approval of the board's rules, standards, budget, those were all created by Congress as safeguards to ensure the board's nonpartisan mission was maintained. But in testimony before this subcommittee, the PCAOB Chair Williams indicated that she was independent in her opinion, and her board acts independently from the commission. And this has got a little transcript. I wanted to go back over and review that. And it absolutely defends and says unequivocally, yes, they are independent. However, as one of Chair Gensler's first acts in June of 2021, when he took over the SEC, was to actually remove that independent PCAOB chair and subsequently remove and replace all the remaining board members of that independent board. So, in fact, Chair Gensler admitted that the PCAOB in testimony here was, in fact, not independent, so clearly there is a disconnect. So, Mr. Burton, by ousting former Chair Dunkey and removing the full board and inserting his hand-picked replacements onto that board, did Chair Gensler politicize the PCAOB and erode its independence?
He certainly exercised the authority that the SEC has over the PCAOB.
In spades, yes.
I actually think that the independence of a lot of these organizations, PCAOB, FEDRA, MSRB, is sort of fictitious.
Okay, yeah. Let me hit on that. You know, I am not one to hand over authority to the SEC or any other regulator willy-nilly and without purpose and reason. But since the SEC already conducts oversight of the PCAOB, including approving the board's rules, standards, budget, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that the PCAOB operate as a separate entity.
But it does have an adverse effect in that all of the protections we associate with government, the requirements with respect to regulatory analysis, due process, transparency, the Sunshine Act, Freedom of Information Act, none of that exists. So a lot of things that protect the public and enable you to conduct meaningful oversight over the PCAOB do not exist as it's currently structured, and your legislation would solve that problem.
Well, and that's what I was getting at. I think is, as we look at it, having the SEC's examiners and its chief accountant absorb all of the PCAOB's responsibilities seems like a reasonable direction. Does that seem accurate to you?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Chair Wagner, I just do want to also say thank you for attaching our bill to this, the Streamlining Public Company Accounting Oversight Act, and this hearing. That essentially would fold the PCAOB into the SEC. And as I said, I don't take handing over more authority to the SEC lightly, but we cannot call something independent if it is not actually independent. And this way, we would have the ability to hold to account the person who's actually running it, which is the chair of the SEC. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Wagner. You know, Miss Miss Thornton. My friend Chair Gensler recently condemned artificial intelligence watching as the abuse of AI when members of the financial sector make false claims and charges about its use, stating that such activities could violate existing security laws. And our regulators themselves have warned that some investment advisors and broker-dealers are quietly saying that they use artificial intelligence to generate higher returns on investments, and that executives at some publicly traded firms are attempting to improve their stock prices by using AI. And so, Ms. Thornton, the SEC recently took steps to charge a number of companies who engage in this type of investor abuse with violating the existing marketing rule of the Advisors Act. So, Ms. Thornton, I want to ask you, is this statute enough to ensure that the SEC continues to hold bad actors accountable? If not, what more can we do?
Well, I think that its efforts on enforcing the marketing rules are very, very important. And it can go a long way, and we've seen that it has brought cases like the one you mentioned. But I think when it comes to AI, Chair Gensler has been very clear that there are possibly unique risks associated with AI that require us to take a closer look. He's deeply knowledgeable about AI, and I think that he's very interested in considering whether there are other rules that should be taken.
Yeah, but let me ask you this, because this is important. Artificial intelligence is here. It's here for our productive use. But how can we ensure that the SEC does not exhibit hostility towards technological innovation that could have a positive increase in our access to our markets among low-income and underserved investors?
Well, I think that Chair Gensler has acknowledged the value of AI, the many good aspects of AI, and it's just a question of how you create the guardrails. But I think that it's important to make sure that any guardrails protect the very people that you're talking about who may not understand how it's being used. But I'm not a deep expert on AI, so that's probably about all I can say on that.
Well, AI is with us.
It is.
And we've got to make sure it serves us properly. And when used responsibly, I too believe that artificial intelligence has the unique and transformative potential to improve inclusion, efficiency, and user experience within our financial system. We got the best financial system in the world. And the world depends on the United States financial system as the bulwark in making sure this happens. However, absent a robust regulatory regime addressing the rise in false and misleading statements regarding the use of intelligence technology, we risk hurting more investors. And let me conclude by, this is sort of like the instrument that we created to serve us. We must not become creatures of which we become servants of AI. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Digital Assets, Financial Technology, and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I thank our panel for being with us today. We've heard directly from the SEC director-level officials over the course of the last few months, and we've certainly enjoyed having Chairman Gensler here to have his point of view on behalf of the commission. So it's great to have your expertise, and we thank you for being with us. You know, not only has the SEC lost in the court of public opinion, even on a bipartisan base here on Capitol Hill, but the agency is now getting trampled by the federal courts as well, especially as it relates to digital assets. In July 2023, a New York judge determined that Ripple Labs did not violate federal securities law by selling its XRP token on public exchanges. In fact, in that case, they were referred to as being arbitrary and capricious. Last August, the court rejected the SEC's reasoning for blocking Grayscale's Bitcoin trust from converting to an exchange-traded fund. And just in the last few days, a Utah judge imposed sanctions on the SEC for, quote, bad faith conduct and, open quote, gross abuse of power, close quote, that the commission had demonstrated in a case against Dropbox. And this is important because we haven't talked about this in a long time in this committee. And as a result of that gross abuse of power, the commission is required to pay the legal fees, which means that our constituent tax dollars are now being used to pay for the SEC's overreach and failure. So whether it's refusing to comply with the Administrative Procedures Act or not, or providing clear rules of the road for the digital asset ecosystem, it's clear that the SEC under Gary Gensler blatantly and repeatedly oversteps its statutory authority. Our citizens are also very concerned about privacy and very concerned about their private information. We've seen the Office of Personnel Management have records leak. We've seen the IRS see constituent records leak. We've seen the CFPB collect transaction data on consumers and seen it leak. We've seen FinCEN now collect millions of records for beneficial ownership. And finally, the SEC is proposing to collect every American's brokerage account statement, every trade, every day through their consolidated audit trail. They've tried to work on this for a decade, but they are now planning to roll that out as we speak. FINRA President Robert Cook testified here that even his 80-year-old mother's information will be stored in the CAT, despite absence of any likelihood that an investor like his mom would try to manipulate the stock market. So, Mr. Gulliver, let me start with you. Do you believe that the biggest cyber vulnerabilities are CAT? What do you think are the biggest risks to the consolidated audit trail from a cyber point of view?
I think it's completely unnecessary for the CAT to store Social Security numbers for all U.S. investors, and it would be there's a real risk there that it could be breached and this information would be exposed.
And we've asked both Robert Cook at FINRA and the SEC what their plan is to protect that PII, personal identity type information, and they've not really responded effectively with what that plan is. Do you consider that if they do store it, it's at risk for breach?
Yes.
Ms. Schlipp, as a former enforcement attorney at FINRA, can you explain why the SEC can still do its job effectively without collecting this personally identifiable information of investors through the audit trail?
Well, the SEC has been able to do it for years and has continued to be able to do so with the transaction data without the personally identifiable information that's already been collected in the CAT.
Right.
The way it previously worked is that the SEC, upon noticing some sort of pattern or suspicious activity, would create a request for the investor's information to the brokerage firm.
Right. This is something that we've done for years. We have market surveillance of our exchanges, and we have surveillance of the activities of every brokerage firm, and we can do a sweep exam and get this information. I really believe this is a huge expense that's unnecessary, which is why I support Congressman Barry Loudermilk's bill to protect that PII. Let me stick with you, Counselor. The cost estimate was originally $55 million to implement the consolidated audit trail. Most recent estimate, $250 million, and increasing at the rate of 30% per year. If the consolidated audit trail, who ultimately bears the expense of this item that you say is unnecessary?
The investors will.
I think the investors will. I think it's a bad idea. I'll yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity. Again, I thank all the witnesses for being here. At the beginning of the hearing, I heard that we should talk about real-world impacts, and the SEC should be worried about real-world impacts and not theoretical stuff. I agree with that. How many of you believe in climate change? If you could raise your hand. Okay, so did everyone raise their hand? Yes. Okay, so that's a real-world impact then? I would say it is. I mean, if you all believe in it, I certainly do. Yesterday, the Republican chairman of the Texas State Board of Education pulled $8.5 billion in investment from BlackRock. For years, BlackRock has outperformed the market and provided positive returns for the Texas Permanent School Fund, a fund specifically created to support the state's public schools. However, because of my good friends on the other side's anti-ESG dogma, culture war politics have been prioritized over the well-being of constituents. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. but a trend. A recent study by the Texas Association of Business Chamber of Commerce Foundation found that Republican anti-ESG laws have cost Texas taxpayers an average of $270 million a year in debt-related costs since the measure took effect in 2021. Thankfully, the Securities and Exchange Commission has decided to put people over politics and to listen to investors. Earlier this month, as we've been noting, the SEC and the Securities Exchange Commission adopted rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures by public companies. These long-awaited rules require companies to disclose information about climate risks that have materially impacted their businesses, operations, and strategy. Additionally, companies must disclose costs, expenditures, and losses incurred because of severe weather events, such as wildfires and flooding, which drastically impacted my constituents in San Diego, which we would have never thought would happen. A 1,000-year flood in San Diego would happen. We know that climate risk is a financial risk. I applaud the SEC for considering feedback from investors, businesses, and academics, industry experts, and Congress. A recent Morgan Stanley Institute for Sustainable Investment reports and reflects that over 75% of individual investors believe that corporations should address environmental impacts and plan to make sustainable investments based on those decisions. You know, I agree, Ms. Norton, what you said earlier. You know, information is what makes capitalism work. This is information that I think is one material, but investors want it. Am I wrong about that? You were talking about that earlier. I mean, isn't this what investors want these days?
Oh, absolutely. It has profound impact potentially on companies.
Why is this profound impact? Why?
Well, for two reasons. One, the physical risks of climate change. We now know that these billion-dollar disasters are increasing. There's coastal flooding, and more is expected in the next, 5 to 10 years. So there's that. Companies that have operations in those areas are at risk and need to make a plan, and investors need to know that they have a plan. But there are also transition risks because there are all kinds of states changing laws, creating laws that they hope to protect.
And there are even states where you can't even seem to get insurance these days because the insurance companies take a look at these risks and say, that's not a good risk for us, we're not going to insure it, we can't get the right price. I mean, that's what's happening now. I do want to talk the last minute and a half I have about cost-benefit analysis. I do think that it's important to look at the cost of something, but how do you measure discrimination against women? What's the cost? And especially, let's say a mother who is discriminated against because she's a woman, what is the cost to her daughters that are watching that? How do you measure that? Sorry, how do you measure that?
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's difficult to measure many of the benefits of rules that are done that help people like that, and difficult to measure many of the costs. But the whole point of the cost-benefit analysis is not to get in an absolute perfect answer, but rather to weigh things and get more information. And the honest truth is that the SEC actually needs more high-level economists to be able to really do what folks on the other side want them to do on cost-benefit analysis, so they need a better budget, bigger budget.
And that's why I'm not against taking a look at the cost of things, but I guess you have to look at it holistically because some of these things lead to really awful conclusions when you take a look at the cost of something. Discrimination. You can say, well, that's not much of a cost. We just get somebody else to do it. It doesn't have to be a woman. Well, no, you discriminated against her because she's a woman. That's not right. But anyway, with that, I've got 7 seconds. I will yield back, and thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you all very, very much for being here with us. So, small businesses, backbone of America's growth, they do face significant barriers in accessing capital, including from excessive regulations, inflation, interest rates, new bank reserve requirements, loss of profits, scope requirements, the list goes on. The regulatory processes at the SEC have lacked inclusion, for lack of a better word, and do not foster trust and facilitate market participation. So I have 2 pieces of legislation noticed at today's hearing aimed at addressing these issues, including the Access Act, HR 6825, and a discussion draft of legislation that will increase accountability and provide transparency into important SEC staff-level actions. So, Ms. Schultz, I'd like to start with you, please. As you know, companies are required to file financial statements that are reviewed by independent public accounting firms if they conduct a regulation crowdfunding offering that exceeds $100,000. My bill, H.R. 6825, the Access Act of 2023, raises that threshold from $100,000 to $250,000, as was done without issue during COVID. So I'll just ask you, do you think this legislation will have a positive impact on small businesses that are considering raising money in a crowdfunding offering?
I believe so, and I think the fact that it was done without issue for more than 18 months during COVID is a sign that that was well accepted and is a reasonable change to be made.
Great. And the fact that it sometimes will cost as much as $10,000 for these small businesses for their accountants and other requirements to raise $100,000, that's a pretty steep percentage. Do you agree?
Really, any additional cost that a small business needs to undertake to deal with its financial statements at that small of a capital raise is an undue burden.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Gulliver, a discussion draft of legislation attached to this hearing that could make certain actions by SEC staff, including Rule 14A-8, no action letters and denials, reviewable by the Commission, and require a report to Congress of their actions. We sent it to you. I'm not sure, Mr. Gulliver, if you're how familiar you are with it, but in doing so, the goal is to increase accountability, period, around such SEC actions that take place outside of the formal rulemaking process. If you're familiar with what we just recently sent you, and I appreciate it if you are, could you comment on this action?
Yeah, I think these no action letters now are handled by the SEC staff through delegated authority from the Commission, and there is, not a lot of transparency in how these decisions are made. They're made largely at the staff level, and I'd be supportive of a bill that would enhance transparency of these decisions, especially when they have a major impact on the market.
Have you found, not to be political here, but that these concerns of the process have been or could be politicized by SEC staff, especially with the ESG-related shareholder proposals?
Yeah, I certainly think these no action letters in general can pertain to issues that are political. So as SEC staff,
right. Just get subjective at a certain point. Yep. Right. Mr. Burton, question for you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how disruptive has the SEC's speed of new regulations and other actions been to capital markets and capital formation this SEC over the last 3 years and 2 months, on a scale of 1 to 10, or if you want to express it?
Well, I think there's two sides to that. In terms of the proactive regulatory agenda, it's a 9.5 to 10. The climate change rules and then all the various things they have in their pipeline and so on down. But on the flip side, it's close to 0 because you mentioned concern about entrepreneurs and small businesses trying to raise capital. There's a need to fix a lot of things, and the SEC has simply utterly failed to address the entrepreneurial capital formation issues. Finders being an example, your crowdfunding rules. The SEC made the crowdfunding regulation much worse than it had to be, and so on down the line. It's a long list of failures of small businesses by the SEC.
My next question was going to be on a scale to 1 to 10, how helpful, but I don't think I think you've just answered that. All right, I yield back, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel for joining us today. Mr. Gulliver, many on this committee have compared SEC's recent rulemaking as throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Now, I'm a strong supporter of increased regulation to maintain strong capital markets, but there is a balance to be struck where you don't overregulate and stifle the ability of our markets to operate, and you don't underregulate, leaving avenues for investors to take excessive risk. With that being said, how do you propose the SEC address these issues, and at what point do you believe legislation should be the answer rather than rulemaking from experts?
I think it'd be important to take the economic analysis process more seriously I think the SEC could use additional economists to help them with that process, but it should be sort of the economic analysis should be driving the policy decisions rather than sort of coming after the fact and being more limited.
Thank you. And my next question is for Mr. Burton. Mr. Burton, you mentioned in your testimony that the SEC has set a worrying precedent of short comment periods lasting less than the standard 60 days, especially for complex rulemaking. But I'd be remiss to not mention that the SEC has been receptive to investor feedback and has reopened the comment period for some of the more contentious rulemakings to allow for additional input. And I'm just curious, what do you believe is the magic number for comment period in your eyes? And at what point should rulemaking be 90 days versus 45 days? And what qualifications should we be using to set these deadlines?
I think it depends on the nature of the regulation. If it's, say, just making an inflation adjustment as required by law, the comment period doesn't matter very much. The APA actually has no minimum, but something like an inflation adjustment, 30 days. For something that's a simple rule, easy to grasp, 60 days. And for some of these extraordinarily complex, hundreds of pages of text to absorb, I really think 120 days is appropriate. It simply depends on the nature of the regulation. It's important that we get these things right. It's important that people have the opportunity to give the SEC meaningful comment, not just boilerplate. I think in some of these cases, they simply haven't given people enough time.
Thank you. Are the extensions of the comment periods, have they created a better picture for the SEC of the proposed rules?
Yes. I mean, they extended them, I think, under pressure from the public and particularly industry that they need more time to absorb the rules. And in some cases, the SEC's been responsive to that by reopening the comment periods. They haven't been universally bad about this, just too often.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steil, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Wagner. Start with you, Ms. Schulp, if I can. One of the first things Chair Gensler did at the Securities and Exchange Commission was gut out the proxy advisor rule that was put forward previously. And as we look at Commissioner Ueda, he calls this type of action, quote, regulation by theory and hypothesis. Would you agree that it's an unusual step for the SEC to take? And did it raise concerns about rule quality and legality, in your opinion?
It was an unusual step, and it does raise concerns when the commission has set a rule and finalized it. A new commission coming in and immediately walking it back does not usually result in good rulemaking.
Thank you. So let me follow up then with you, Mr. Gulliver, if I can, on the same topic. Do you think Chairman Gensler prejudged the outcome and stopped a well-researched and important rule from being implemented?
I think the decision came, very, very early in his tenure, and it seemed to be rushed and have immediate effect, and was a major concern.
Thank you. Mr. Burton, kind of on the same broader theme here, Chairman Gensler's and the SEC's unwillingness to rein in proxy advisors, to me, is a larger effort to force politics into the boardroom. And what we're looking at is a loosening of the rules governing proxy advisors, to me, gives them a pass to push misguided, politically motivated proposals with really limited accountability. And so another factor in driving the politicization of investments is a new understanding by the left of materiality. And so based on this new understanding, the SEC sought to deem more ESG issues as de facto material. Can you talk just real briefly about the importance of materiality as a threshold where we continue to see materiality gutted by those on the left?
Well, both in the United States and already in Europe, there's an attempt to redefine materiality in a way much different than traditionally understood. Traditionally, it's material to financial risk and financial outcomes of corporations. Now they're trying to redefine it.
And why would somebody want to skip over a materiality threshold? Why do you, in your research, why do you see that being done time and again?
Yeah, they're trying to redefine it as material as something a proxy advisory firm or a registered investment advisor, BlackRock, would care about, not whether it's material to the financial outcomes.
But why would they care about it? For politically motivated
Yeah,
purposes?
absolutely, and it's for political purposes, social, ideological.
So it doesn't help investors. It's purely someone
That-
driving a
that's
political
correct.
agenda. Is that your
And
your
fiduciaries
conclusion?
are increasingly trying to throw their investors under the bus without their consent to achieve political returns, political objectives rather than investment returns.
I agree. So I'm going to come to you, Mr. Gulliver, if I can. I think it's the same theme. We saw the Securities and Exchange Commission move forward Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, which makes it harder to exclude shareholder proposals on significant social policy questions as determined by the SEC staff. What's the impact that this is having? Does it raise transparency and accountability concerns to you?
Yeah, I think it just increases the burden on public companies. So it's just one other reason why, companies would rather stay private than go public.
So does it provide any benefit does it provide a benefit to investors to analyze the financial or investment thesis of a business, or is it simply being utilized to drive forward a political agenda?
I think it definitely has political connotations.
I think it is really concerning when we see staff at the SEC under this legal bulletin being able to run roughshod over what are historical and traditional mechanisms for making sure that we have proper oversight and guidance over companies, but instead leveraging that authority to drive forward a political agenda, I think is incredibly concerning. With the 50 seconds we have left, Mr. Gulliver, in your opening remarks, you noted, I think, an important topic, and I'd just like you to elaborate briefly on how the Gensler's SEC's actions differ from those carried out under previous chairs, and in particular, how you think that the chairman of the SEC is doing.
Chair Gensler's actions, he's implemented substantially more rules than either of his predecessors, Chair White or Chair Clayton, and almost as many as Chair Shapiro, who was there during the financial crisis and implementation of Dodd-Frank. So I think what we're seeing is pretty unprecedented in a time without a market crisis or new legislation.
I thank you all for being here. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I'm struck that this hearing reminds me of what I've long felt about this job, that the single loneliest position in Washington, D.C. is to be an advocate for competitive markets. There is not a single business who comes to Washington, who pays their lobbyists, who pays the budget of the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute to say, can you please make my market safer for competitors? Can you please lower barriers to entry, lower barriers to exit, increase transparency of information? Nobody does that. And let none of us in this room ever trust someone who claims to be pro-market when all they're really doing is to try to protect the power of the powerful. I say that just to say, let's be honest here as we get into this. Mr. Burton, I am quite certain you and I disagree on whether the SEC's climate disclosure rule was a good idea, but hopefully you do agree that the Commission did in fact receive significant public feedback and made adjustments in response to that feedback. Yes, I see you nodding your head.
Oh,
Yes.
definitely. They got a lot of comments.
Good, okay. Because I know that, I saw that you said that they had, the draft rule, in your opinion, would have raised costs by 300%. Now you think it's 20%. Setting aside whether I agree with that, that sounds like significant change. They did, in fact, respond to a lot of comments, make adjustments in response to a stakeholder process. Let's not forget that. Ms. Schulp, in a podcast you did last week, you said that companies already provide a ton of voluntarily disclosed financial information. I just want to be clear, that's not consistently described, right? They don't have a standard format. They're providing this in ways that they choose to describe, correct?
I was referring to climate-specific financial.
Yes, but they are not providing that in a consistent format.
Unless it is information that they're providing
Or-
in SEC filings. where
Which
they
doesn't
do
exist yet,
provide
right? Because we don't actually mandate consistent formats. So, Ms. Thornton, can you please educate our economically moderately literate members in the room why basic economics, why competitive markets, why investor protection demands that we provide consistent, accurate information?
Because If you don't standardize it somehow and make a format, investors may not be able to find it. If you don't tag the information, investors may not be able to find it in the voluminous 10Ks that are filed. And that information needs to be in a format where an investor can compare it 1 year to the next, so it's consistently reported from 1 year to the next, so the investor can see whether the company is making progress on the commitment that it made about reducing its emissions or whatever.
And isn't that true for all accounting? Like, I mean, look, there's probably businesses who could make more money if they didn't have to comply with GAAP accounting.
Correct.
Right? It would probably be cheaper for them if they didn't have to have audited financials, wouldn't it?
Probably, but
Does anybody think we should not have GAAP accounting? I mean, my God, we're complaining that there's a cost of providing information. Free markets are awesome. Sing it from the rafters. I hope that's not partisan someday. Let me talk about a couple things here just for the record. In 2020, the Trump Commodity Future Trading Corporation issued a report managing climate risk in the financial sector that said, and I quote, "Climate change poses a major risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system. Regulators and financial institutions need reliable, consistent, and comparable data and projection for climate risk exposure sensitivity." That was the Trump White House. 2021 report from FSOC said that climate change is an emerging threat to the U.S. financial system. I could go on. Show of hands. Raise your hand if you agree that climate risk can pose a significant risk to the U.S. financial system. Only the Democrats raise their hand. That is freaking insane, people. You're going to deny. Let me remind you, insurers are pulling out of Florida. They are pulling out of Louisiana. They're pulling out of Texas. Who is California? Who is left holding the bag? Those are billions of dollars, and we're going to somehow deny that this is real. Look, I get it. You're protecting the interests of the powerful. Those of us up here have to represent everybody. Mr. Burton, I understand that you are one of the authors of Project 2025, which provides a, quote, conservative blueprint for the next Republican president. Yes, that's true?
I was a co-author of the Treasury chapter and the author of the SEC chapter.
That is massively irresponsible. I want to just point out, in the time I've left, Richard Nixon created the EPA. Ronald Reagan's EPA said we need to use the markets to price environmental externalities. That led to the Montreal Protocol, a global agreement on pollution control. George H.W. Bush's White House extended that to the acid rain trading program. Do not be an embarrassment to the party of Nixon, the party of Lincoln, the party of Reagan, the economics profession.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
I'd be happy to talk to you then.
Just say that I would caution all members of this committee to maintain the decorum that has always been consistent in the Financial Services Committee.
Will
We're
the
a group-
gentlelady yield?
The gentleman,
Will the
gentlelady,
gentlelady
I
yield?
absolutely will not. I would like all to remain decorum, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Burton, I'll start with you. Under Chair Gensler, the SEC has proposed sweeping new regulatory requirements, often without a clear, data-driven need. We've seen this through his overhaul of the regulations governing equity markets, to his plan to alter the liquidity risk management requirements for open-end funds. Over this time, Commissioner Ueda has often referred to this approach as, we've heard before, it's been brought up several times, regulation by theory and hypothesis. Mr. Burton, would you explain some of the problems with Chair Gensler's rulemaking approach?
Well, for one, he's extraordinarily aggressive in terms of his objectives, and most of those objectives on the important rulemakings are not really related to the core mission of the SEC, the statutory charge of the SEC. They're to pursue environmental objectives. The human capital management rule that's in the regulatory pipeline is basically to pursue objectives that are more appropriately at the DOL or the NLRB, and so on down the line. The corporate board diversity rule presumably will be something similar to the NASDAQ board diversity rule and impose racial, ethnic, or sex quotas on boards unless they explain why they didn't meet the quota. It's a form of racism that I thought was a relic of the past. So you have that. You also have the fact that the economic analysis at the SEC, and this predates Chairman Gensler, but it's becoming increasingly bad and not serious. And there's a fairly long list, but I don't want to take all your time.
Well, that was my next question. Does the SEC's economic analysis suffer from Gensler's pace of rulemaking? And you just said yes, it's getting extremely bad. So I appreciate that answer, and I agree. I think he's treating everything as if it's a security, and he's putting out rules. There's another one. I know, Michelle, you brought it up about the cybersecurity rule and his new one in.
On that, the SEC has operationally adopted the position anything you buy for the purpose of making money is a security, which is, of course, not true. It can be real estate, it can be a commodity, or so on down the line.
Absolutely. And I wanted to bring up about the cybersecurity rule. We're now seeing what we thought was going to happen. The hackers are actually using this rule to their benefit and are reporting people that they're hacking just to the SEC to get them in trouble. So, everybody agrees investor information is important, but not at the cost of national security. And I asked Mr. Gensler if that was, which was more important, and he did not seem to think that national security would suffer, but we're now seeing that. But Ms. Schulp, I want to bring back Mr. Hill, my colleague, was questioning, had some questions before on the CAT. While CAT is problematic on several fronts, I'd first like to focus on its implications for American privacy. The security concerns with collecting personal identifiable information was touched on, but I'd like to provide you with the opportunity to further explain the potential dangers of this practice.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. The CAT is collecting all transaction information, buys, sells, cancellations for every trade done in the United States, along with the personal information of the trader. What that creates is a giant database of information about how investors are spending their money, which says a lot about people's beliefs, their desires, their political opinions, the way they think that the country's economy is going to grow. And that information is being required to be provided to the government, likely in violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, and it raises First Amendment issues as well with this expressive speech and how people are investing. That type of information should not be given to the government to scan at will to determine whether or not someone is investing in a way that the government feels is appropriate. That is not, it's a major privacy concern, and that type of surveillance is something that we have largely rejected, and we should continue to reject and not allow the SEC to go down that path.
In addition to the PII concerns and privacy concerns, there's also cost concerns. Would you support, or do you think we should move the CAT onto the SEC's budget?
I think that's a better way to start thinking about how to control the costs if the CAT were to go forward. Allowing the SEC to essentially dictate this new tax or fee on investors is contrary to the powers of the SEC. That should be something Congress is supposed to do, not the SEC. And if this were to go forward, it should be part of the SEC.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Madam Chair, and our ranking member, our witnesses for being here. Thanks so much. While I applaud the great work of the SEC to protect investors, I have some concerns about the policy and the process surrounding the SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121. So my questions are more process related, Mr. Gulliver. What we're seeing makes the digital assets industry less safe for consumers by preventing well-regulated banks from safeguarding digital assets owned by their clients. Last October, the GAO concluded that the SEC breached statutory rulemaking requirements by issuing SAB 121, as it meets the Administrative Procedure Act's definition of a rule and must be submitted to Congress for approval. That's why our committee passed a bipartisan Congressional Review Act resolution last month to eliminate SAB 121. Mr. Gulliver, aren't staff accounting bulletins supposed to guide market participants in understanding and interpreting existing rules rather than making new policies as SAB 121 does?
Yes, they should. SAB 121's extremely harmful for investors in crypto markets. They'd benefit from having custody from well-regulated financial institutions, and SAB 121 prevents it.
So what should the SEC have done differently?
Well, I think they should rescind SAB 121, and they should actually promulgate rules that would allow for the regulation of crypto exchanges so investors in crypto markets can be better protected.
Certainly agree. I hope they will withdraw the rule. I haven't heard any news about that happening anytime soon, but that would be a good way to go. Moving on to the PDA rule, the SEC's predictive data analytics rule. I agree with the SEC's rationale for eliminating investor harm resulting from AI. However, I'm worried about the rule's adverse effects on innovation and retail investors seeking inclusion in the financial system. The proposal scope is extremely broad and could be applied to virtually any technology used by broker-dealers and investment advisors. So as we sit here today, I understand that the SEC is grappling with whether and how to narrow the rule's scope to be workable for market participants. While I respect the work of the Commission's staff is doing to try to get this right, the only recourse to address such an overly broad and inherently flawed rule is to withdraw and repropose it after adequate stakeholder engagement. I worry that the rule could be finalized with substantial changes and no public notice or comment period. Mr. Gulliver, to you again, can changes be made to the rule without the SEC running afoul of the Administrative Procedures Act?
No, I think finalizing that rule in any form would violate the APA. The final rule needs to be a logical outgrowth of the rule proposal according to federal law, and the rule proposal was so extreme that it couldn't possibly be finalized.
And Mr. Gulliver, how is the SEC engaged with your members on this rule?
I'm not aware of the extent of communication between the SEC and our members on that. We've met our staff with the SEC to discuss this rule and shared views consistent with those that I just expressed.
And in terms of the process, what's been most concerning to you during this rulemaking process?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues, and you can see this for all the SEC rulemakings, is that they're issuing these pretty extreme proposals and not consulting with market participants before doing so. So that's how you get into this problem, and that's not typical for the SEC. Past SECs under Democratic or Republican leadership typically have public roundtables and consult extensively with the market before a proposal is issued.
So, with all the issues we talked about, how could we here in Congress improve on the SEC's regulatory process?
Well, a number of things: providing more opportunity for public comment, requiring the SEC to re-propose a rule when a final rule would deviate too much from the proposal, and the various enhancements to the economic analysis process. And I also think that having the chair and the commissioners speak to you all would also be helpful.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here and helping address our concerns on this important topic. Like my fellow members of the committee, I'm extremely alarmed by the pace and aggressiveness of the SEC rulemaking, which will add to the cumulative regulatory burden on companies and the U.S. economy. To make matters worse, this constant stream of proposals has regularly been paired with concerns of regulatory overreach, theoretical assumptions and hypothesis, solutions in search of a problem, and the alarming absence of stakeholder input and meaningful cost-benefit analysis during the rulemaking process. Chair Gensler's frenetic partisan rulemaking agenda has threatened the health of U.S. capital markets, highlighting the need for targeted institutional reform. Ms. Schulp, this hearing has a few bills attached to it intended to continue committee Republicans' goal of spurring capital formation. Under Chair Gensler, the SEC has completely neglected this aspect of its statutory mission, opting instead to raise compliance costs and regulatory burdens. What are the consequences of the SEC neglecting this important duty?
The consequences are terrible. In fact, when we have smaller businesses that are unable to raise capital, we don't have businesses that can continue to grow into bigger businesses. It creates a drag on the economy and creates a drag on the ability of investors to have companies to invest in as well.
Thank you. And as I alluded to earlier, a concern that goes with the flow of new burdensome proposals is the lack of meaningful consideration of stakeholder input. Ms. Schulp, As someone that has written plenty of comment letters in response to SEC rulemakings, can you discuss the amount of time and work it takes to submit a comment letter addressing each of the SEC's questions while also evaluating their data?
Well, I think it's impossible to address each of the SEC's questions in any given comment letter and any given rule proposal they put out that often runs in the hundreds of questions. SEC rule proposals tend to run in the hundreds of pages, and this is a very burdensome task. First, a company must determine, or a commenter generally must determine whether or not they're interested in commenting and prioritize their ability to comment on multiple letters at the same time. Personally, as someone who writes comments, it takes 60 to 80 hours minimum for me to review and write a comment. The SEC would put my time as an attorney at about $600 an hour, which means that a comment letter costs somewhere between $36,000 and $48,000 to write. I think that's a lowball estimate, and that's a big burden, particularly on smaller businesses who don't have staff or resources to be able to outsource multiple comment letters at the same time. It really decreases the ability of a company to make a comment on a rule that might affect them.
So in your opinion, why is the SEC acting inappropriately when it imposes substantial hurdles to prevent thoughtful public feedback?
Well, the APA is built on thoughtful public feedback, and thoughtful public feedback is important to creating good public policy. Not allowing conditions where that can happen is a major problem.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wagner, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Like many members on this committee, the consequences of SEC rulemaking come up almost every day in my meeting with constituents, business leaders, and fellow Iowans. From Main Street to Wall Street insurance firms in Des Moines, the cascading effects of rulemaking after rulemaking have negatively impacted their ability to not only do business, but serve their customers and their clients in my hometowns. Worse yet, it isn't just the SEC, it's the unelected bureaucrats from almost every agency that are causing a regulatory havoc on our hometown communities. In fact, I believe if this administration gets its way, Madam Chair, the SEC will finalize 63 new rules impacting IO companies in just 4 years. And it's just that one agency, one that the SEC has been blasted for its gross overregulation in this environment. As was noted today, it's now easier for a company to work to sue and go to court to get regulatory clarity from these agencies than it is to deal with the massive cost of trying to make a compliance that may or may not fall in line with an ever-changing regulatory and rule system, particularly coming from the SEC. And so whether it's Chairman Gensler's intention or not, the unintended consequences of his actions are very clear. Within the industry, making it impossible for small businesses, new businesses, innovative businesses, longtime Main Street businesses, just to keep their doors open. The bottom line, in my state, I can say clearly, Madam Chairwoman, Iowans are suffering. So I know colleagues on both sides of the aisle are not going to continue to stand by and allow the regulatory overreach to be what defines it. I'd like to talk both on the insurance and custody role. Mr. Gulliver, I'm concerned about the SEC's expanding authority and its often role in superseding our state and local officials who are really leaders in this area. One example of this is the SEC's attempt to overhaul the custody rule and possibly include a fee-based annuities within the scope of regulation. This would require unworkable within many of our state laws and take authority from state insurance regulators who have successfully overseen the insurance industry in my home state for over 150 years. As a member who represents an industry that's a critical component of our economy, in fact 12%, I want to know if you can explain why this is a concerning trend that the chairman should continue to push the boundaries of his authority well beyond their limits and infringe on state abilities to do this.
I think the custody rule is another example of a proposal that really can't be finalized. It's just too extreme. It sweeps in assets that really can't be custodied in the way that the SEC would now require. And the existing process for registered investment advisors and custody, that the custody that they provide their clients isn't broken. So the SEC really hasn't established that there's a problem either. So the custody rule is a major problem.
I would concur with you on that, Mr. Gulliver. I think you are right when you say it is not a rule that is broken. In fact, it's a rule that is well in hand for most of our state regulators. Ms. Schulp, I'd like to talk about AI and innovation, particularly in this area. I'm concerned about the SEC's use of a blunt one-size-fits-all approach to its rulemaking, particularly regarding new technologies coming on the market. In Chairman Gensler's world, real-world analytics and cost-benefit analysis cease to exist. Just bad actors, broad sweeping rules that do not allow our economy to flourish. In fact, in his world, everyone is a violator. It's just a matter of finding the right regulation to hold them accountable. So with that, I guess I would be interested to hear that the federal judge sanctioned the SEC's, what they identify in this regulation as a gross abuse of power, but beyond that, ultimately pay the price to shut down companies that the SEC has pushed away, shut down other companies here in America, and push them overseas. Just yesterday, Chairman Gensler said that powerful AI systems in the financial system make up the potential for an economic disaster, particularly acute here in the United States. This level of fear-mongering is frightening. Can you explain why the SEC's approach to rulemaking is chilling innovation or may even hurt technologies for decades to come?
This approach to regulation is absolutely the wrong one. And this is, say, as a side note, an important reason why it's good to hear from the entire commission, not just from the chair, who gets the most airtime in order to take these types of fear-mongering statements about innovation. Statements on AI, statements on crypto, all of these are making business environments in the United States much more uncertain, if not downright hostile. Other countries, the European Union, many in the Middle East, many in the Far East, are creating regulatory systems for crypto that are much more friendly and workable, and at the very least are more certain.
Gentleman, time has expired.
Thank you, Ms. Schubert.
Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Houchin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Ranking Member Sherman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Under Chair Gensler, we've seen the SEC move at an unprecedented pace to propose and then finalize politicized rulemakings that hurt our markets, discourage growth, and do nothing to help those who are trying to save for retirement and better their lives. From proposals like those on swing pricing, predictive data analytics that cut off tools and opportunities for everyday investors, to the recently finalized rule on climate disclosures that goes well beyond the Commission's statutory authority and pushes a Green New Deal agenda. The SEC under this administration has shown time and again that it is committed to pursuing ideological goals at the expense of ordinary Americans. In my view, and many that serve on this committee, that has to change. With the number of wide-ranging effects that we've seen from the Commission under Chair Gensler, one of my foremost concerns is the way that the cumulative effect of this will change the way our U.S. capital markets work. This issue goes well beyond just the SEC. We've also seen financial regulators become increasingly interested in implementing the initiatives of international organizations between Basel III, the new environmental accounting standards coming out of the UN, and the EU's Corporate Sustainability Directive. I'm concerned we don't fully understand yet the potential consequences that all of these rules will have on our markets. Mr. Gulliver, I'd like to ask you, what do you see are the potential consequences of implementing international policies without input from our market participants and stakeholders?
I think there's a real risk that the policies that would be implemented in the U.S. wouldn't be in the United States' best interest. Our financial institutions and market participants have unique perspectives, and those need to be incorporated in rules here.
Thank you. There's little need for us to take directives from outside the United States, especially as other proposals from our federal regulators are threatening to change the ways that our markets currently operate. A few weeks ago, the House voted to pass Chairman McHenry's H.R. 2799, the Expanding Access to Capital Act of 2023. As a member of the Rules Committee, I was proud to manage the floor debate on the rule that provided for its passage. It also included my legislation, the Regulation A+ Improvement Act, as part of the bill. Together, these proposals would strengthen our public markets and expand opportunities for small and mid-sized businesses to raise capital and create new investment opportunities for everyday Americans. The committee, this committee understands just how important capital formation is to creating new jobs and achieving economic growth. That's why I've been so upset at the SEC's direction under Chair Gensler that they've neglected their statutory obligation and prioritized other items like ideologically driven climate reporting mandates and crackdowns on investment advisors' use of basic technology over its obligation to promote capital formation. Mr. Burton, are there better ways for the SEC to spend its limited resources rather than this hyper-focus on achieving their partisan objectives?
Yes, and I go into quite a bit of detail in my written statement, but the core function of the SEC is extraordinarily important to our capital markets, to the success of our economy, and the standard of living in this country. And it needs to focus on that instead of pursuing these ideological and political objectives that are simply not related to the core mission of the SEC. And it's about to get worse. If you look at the regulatory pipeline that they filed with OIRA, it's full of politically motivated rules. So the core point is, but also the fact that the agency is so badly run. They waste so much money on things that are, it's not ideological, it's just incompetence. And they need to work on that as well. I mean, there's one manager for every non-supervisory employee at the SEC, for example. I mean, it's just bureaucratic and ineffective.
Inefficient. Instead of prioritizing its congressionally directed mission, they seem to be focused on squashing opportunities for growth, adding more red tape for average investors, without any concern for the effects of all of this cumulative rulemaking and what that will do to the financial market. They also seem to be, as you stated, acting not only inefficiently, but maybe incompetently on some of these fronts. And looking at things that if I were a business owner seeking investments from other individuals, I would want to look at the bottom line and not the climate effect necessarily of what we've got going on. I appreciate the witness's testimony today, and I yield back to the chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Wagner, for allowing me to wade into this very important hearing and noticing my bill, H.R. 7030, the Reg Act. Since the spring of 2021, the SEC has proposed and finalized over 60 rules. When we compare the pace and scope of rulemaking with recent SEC chairs, only former SEC Chair Shapiro has issued more rules than Chair Gensler. My legislation, H.R. 7030, the Reg Act, directs the SEC to review all rules every 5 years. And if the SEC determines that the rule is no longer appropriate or necessary to uphold its three-part mission, the SEC could revise or eliminate it. In addition to the review process, my legislation would require the SEC to consider the cumulative effects of every rulemaking, which is something that Chair Gensler has failed to address. Mr. Gulliver, your group has commented on the substantial overlap between many of Chair Gensler's rules. Even the Department of Justice has indicated that without an assessment of a rule's overlapping effects, the SEC cannot effectively assess the impact on investors, registrants, or the markets. Mr. Gulliver, as you mentioned in your testimony, our capital markets are the largest and most efficient in the world. So would you explain why the SEC's decision to review rules in isolation without considering their aggregate impact and interconnectedness can make our capital markets less efficient?
I think there'll be unnecessary compliance burdens. And then I think even more importantly, there'll be conflicts between rules. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that SEC's securities lending rule and SEC's short selling rule are directly in conflict. One requires disclosure on a daily basis, and the other would delay the disclosure of the very same financial activity for a month. And those are in conflict, and that's in court for that reason now.
Mm-hmm. And how would market participants benefit from an understanding of how related proposals interconnect with each other?
Better understand their compliance burden and it would allow them to, it would better comply.
So would you agree that my legislation can help market participants, investors, and capital formation?
Yes, I think it's critical to look back and assess whether or not rulemakings are still serving their purpose. That's required in the EU now, and that would be an important way that the U.S. could remain competitive internationally.
Right, I agree. My hope is that the SEC understands how each proposed rule can increase costs for smaller market participants. Mr. Sherp, did I say that right? Ms. Sherp, in your written testimony, you speak of a regularized process for revisiting some of the Commission's rules. And my legislation would establish a 5-year review process. So hopefully you agree with the intent of my legislation. So can you elaborate on how a regular review process can help improve efficiencies in our capital markets?
A regular review process is important because what it does is set a schedule. Rather than the political will of a particular chairman, it requires every so many years the review to take place. And that's important because you could very well see a situation where a general idea that we want to revisit rules just never happens when the political will is not there. Taking a look back, particularly where cost-benefit analyses rely on speculative benefits or costs that are not able to yet to be quantified, is very important because then actual costs can be weighed against actual benefits to determine whether the rules are justified or serving their purposes.
Thank you. Under Chair Gensler, the SEC has proposed sweeping new regulatory requirements, often without a clear data-driven need. So this regulation by theory and hypothesis approach is blurring the regulatory lines between the private and public markets. Ms. Sherp, as you know, the SEC's mission is to protect investors, maintain fair and efficient markets, and promote capital formation. However, the SEC under Chair Gensler seems to have neglected its statutory obligation and prioritized other factors over its obligation to promote capital formation. So what factors should the SEC be considering in its economic analysis to properly consider a rule's impact on capital formation?
The gentlelady's
I see
time
my
has expired,
time is up.
and I respectfully ask that the witness respond in writing, if you could. This very important question.
Thank you very much.
I thank you all. With that, the gentlelady yields back, and I can say that we thank our witnesses for their testimony today. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able, and this hearing is now adjourned.